Them Alive by Nace. Read by Al Richardson. Chapter 3. Amid half-crazed shouts of greed for gold, the five of them rushed towards the open stairway that led to the basement. Ramming each other for space on the steps, they half ran, half tumbled to the lower floor. Like scattering ants, they began throwing papers and pictures and furniture, digging madly, poking furiously for the safe, the money, and the treasure for which they had tortured and killed. Peter yelled, "Where the hell's it hid anyway? I'm sick and tired of waiting to get my mitts on it." Zeb growled, "What if there ain't no million here, nowhere? Or nothing else we want either?" But Dyke snapped angrily, "It's here, it's got to be, we'll find it. Everything else has just been like Pete said it would be." And he was the one who spotted the small piece of wall panelling that wasn't as close against the wall as the rest. He made a dive for the place, yanked the board from its location, splitting the panel to bits and tossing the pieces to the floor. Built into the structure of the basement was the door of the safe, set in so that the knob was flush with the surrounding surface. Dyke said, "Okay, Pete. See if you're as good at cracking a safe as you bragged you were." The black man whirled on him, driving a fist into his belly, wishing the wind from him. "You calling me a damn liar, Whitey?" "I'm just saying do it, so do it." Their eyes flamed into each other's, but neither said any more. Dyke thought, "We both understand that we're not real pals, never could be. We don't have the same background, don't think alike on much of anything. Truth is, I'm not what you'd call crazy about any of these guys. And I can tell they aren't about me either. All right then, as somebody once said, unhappy circumstances threw us together. And here we are." Pete settled himself before the safe, took his bottle of glycerine out of its box of cotton and carefully, very carefully, poured the liquid into the cracks around the door of the treasure hold. He then spit into a can of moist clay from his hip pocket, stirred it with his finger, moulded it over the dripping glycerine onto the cracks around the opening of the safe. From his other pocket he took out a small stick of dynamite and a battery, hooked together and powered to trigger an explosion. "Back, you guys!" The four boys pulled away from him. He lighted the fuse that he'd strung across the room and watched it, hopefully, his eyes glowing brightly as the minute streak of fire shot towards the safe. Three of the boys crouched into a corner, their eyes barely above the pile of boxes that fronted for them. But Dyke was on his feet, fascinated. This was a wrinkle he wanted to watch close up. You could never tell when a fresh approach would make you a fortune or save your life. If your whole existence was planned towards crime in its wildest, splashiest way, then you'd better stay on your toes every minute you liked. Dyke had never failed to do exactly that, and he had no present intention of changing the pattern. If the room blew up with the safe, none of them would ever know it. But if things went the way Pete expected them to, the door would explode off, and they'd have their money. God, money. The flame reached the dynamite. Dyke felt his heart pounding, his throat drying. He saw that Zeb was no longer confident. He was as scared as the rest of them. Even the black man's eyes held veiled terror. But Dyke knew that Pete dared not back away, dared not show in his actions the fear he felt. He had to stand closer than the others, had to pretend that there was no doubt of success. Contact. Bang! Years of dust rose from the safe, the walls, the whole basement. It filled the room, crowded Dyke's throat with choking, coughing, spitting. Then he saw the door of the safe drop off with a clattering thud that seemed to shake the house on its foundation, racking the basement from end to end. At last, the dust began to settle. The safe was still there, as safe as a safe should be. The five of them made a frenzied leap towards it. Pete reached it first, with Dyke close behind him. The opening revealed a safe of unbelievable proportions, built like a bank vault and as large as many. There was such space that many men could crawl through the opening and into the concrete room. And the young burglars did, one after another. They crammed themselves through the hole made by the blown door until they sat upon the dirty floor and stared at each other in amazed, overwhelming happiness. Orange crates were stacked about the inside walls of the vault, each of them piled full sacks of bills in neat bundles. There were 10s, 20s, 50s, hundreds, thousands. Dyke had never seen a $100 bill before, much less 1,000. He picked up one of each and fingered them gently, reverently. Then he raised them to his lips and kissed them. God, they're beautiful, he breathed. Pete was grabbing handfuls of the money, filling his pockets. Ryan was holding a 50 in his hands loosely, as though he dared not squeeze it too tightly lest it tear from his grasp and fly out the window. Zeb and Kane were clowning it up, sticking bills in their mouths, up their noses, into their ears. Dyke thought, we're all different, all being ourselves in a situation that is so big, so incomprehensible, that we're reverting to whatever our special nature is. We're still numb from the sight of all this money. We didn't dare believe it, and yet, here it is. He said, have we got time to count it here, or had we better load it up and carry it upstairs and then get out of here fast before some friend or neighbour of old Shield comes by and finds him? Pete directed, I'll decide what we do, Dyke. This was my idea, and I'll give the orders about it. Ryan said, it can't be as much money as Pete said it was. Nothing that good could ever happen to me. No Navajo reservation boy as poor as me ever got a fifth of whatever this is. Pete issued his orders. Listen to me good, you whiteys. We stash this bread in the car and head for the Redding Ranch. We drive so far into it that nobody'll ever find us. It's so damn big that plenty of guys have got lost and died there, or lost their minds before anybody found them in their 1,000,000 acres of pasture and stuff. Dyke queried, do they have guards at the ranch, at every gate, so you can't get in? Pete shook his head. You think I'd be taking us there if I didn't know it was all right, you damn dummy. No, they don't have guards anymore. Used to be. They didn't want no visitors, my cuz said, but nowadays they like to show off their big fine cattle and their prize racehorses. Cuz said it's wide open. Only cattle guards are there, and they don't keep nobody out. Just a slug of pipe in the openings of the fence. Said there's security guys at the house and at the racehorse barns and special pastures where the best cattle are. Lights are there too. But I don't aim for us to go near them places. We're going to head in with our own lights off and keep going. When it's daylight, we'll go back even farther, or maybe we'll hightail it to Mexico as soon as we've got a little sleep. Anyway, we'll count the bread then. Zeb said, yeah, man. First thing we're going to do when we stop is count the loot. Not till morning, Pete ordered. We're not going to turn on no flashlights in that pasture, and nobody try, or I'll beat you to death. We ain't going to have nobody tracking us. No vaqueros or school kids or nobody, because we're going to be all dark. Come daylight, we'll count the bread and divvy it up. Ryan asked softly, You sure you won't get us lost, Pete? I keep remembering you said men had got lost and died in the wilderness of that big old ranch. I hate the reservation, but it sure would beat getting lost and starving in a pasture. Pete waved his hands. When you're damn white, he's going to learn that I'm the boss on this thing, and I know what I'm doing. Hell, I worked on that ranch for a couple of years when I was as big as a pound of soap. Come down here from New York to visit my cousin, worked there for a while. I know my way around the place. Now will you damn dummies shut up? They shrugged their acceptance, began carrying and shoving the boxes towards the opening of the safe. They left no fingerprints since all wore gloves, and they said as little as they pushed the boxes into the basement room, carried them up the stairway, finally stowing them in the trunk of the car, covering them with the filthy old blankets they kept back there to conceal their ammunition. Dyke thought, God, we're secure. It's only 1:30 in the morning. We'll be away from here and deep into the Redding Ranch hours before morning. We can hide out there and get some sleep, wake up and count the dough, and split up like Pete says. And then he paused beside the car, with 2 stacked boxes in his arms, his head whirling, flaming, planning without knowing exactly why, reeling with the possibilities that he feared that he had no wish to harbour, but could not turn loose from his mind. There had to be over 1 million here. Maybe there was as much as 2 million. What could one man do with all that dough if he didn't have to share it? God, he could do anything he wanted, for as long as he lived. A man with $2 million cash could go anywhere in the world, get to a foreign country and take a new name and maybe dye his hair, think up 1,000 ways to disguise himself so no cops could come snooping and try to make a deal to extradite him. He could spend his dough a bill at a time, or more, since the old man surely didn't have any marks on the money, and never let anybody know where he got his fortune. He would have it made, and God, what a life he'd have. Was there any chance that one of the 5 of them, say the one named Dyke Millis, could get away with taking the whole batch of loot? He went breathless at the thought, the possibility, the deepening desire of it. He was the smartest of them all. He was positive he was. If any of them could outwit the others, he could. He'd been bright in school, skipped out when he was a senior in high at 15. He spoke good English, the only one of the 5 who'd bothered to try. The others were so stupid that they'd likely get caught with their share if they divided up the money. They'd be grabbed and arrested. They'd be executed, more likely. Texas still loved a good old death penalty, Supreme Court or not. And in Texas, the Rangers tracked down suspects who gave themselves away if the local police couldn't do it. But Dyke had brains. He'd always known he had. He'd pulled robberies ever since he could remember, and he'd never got caught. He'd beaten up guys and never had them find out who he was. He'd tortured neighbour kids to get their paper money when they'd collected. He'd worn a sack over his head and changed his voice, and nobody had ever suspected him. He could manage the rest of his life fine, if he could get the money away from the other 4 men. He was roused to reality when Ryan said, "Hey, Pete, I sure hate to wait till morning to know how much we got. Can't we count some of it before we leave here?" Pete gave the Indian a half smile. Glad to see you finally found out who was boss here. Tell you what, Whiteys. One of you keep a box up in the car with you. All the boxes look like they got about the same amount of bread. So one of you stash a box on the floor on the back seat and sit down there and count it as we go along. There's a flashlight back there. Get under the blanket and add it up. They all shrieked their delight. Dyke dropped one of his boxes into the trunk and the other one onto the floor of the car. He sat down beside it with Kane beside him. Ryan and Zeb rode up front with Pete. It took them 30 minutes to count the contents of the box 3 times, each one taking a turn at stacking the bills. When they were done, Kane said, "You guys remembering how many boxes we got in the trunk and how much it means if they got what this one's got?" The boys in the front nodded solemnly. For the first time since they started this spree of breaking and entering, murder, safe-cracking and robbery of an eccentric old millionaire's savings, not one of the boys smiled. Then Ryan asked, "How much?" When Dyke and Kane didn't reply at once, Pete bellowed, "You deaf back there? I asked how much. I'm sick and tired of you sitting back there counting and mumbling. Spit it out. How much?" Dyke found his voice. Came out of his daze first. We've got at least $2 million. Pete fell back against the seat, losing his hold on the wheel, letting the car veer towards the ditch and wrestling it back in the nick of time. God almighty, ain't that something? Now. How much is that apiece for us? Meeting silence, he ordered, "You figure it and tell us how much apiece, Dyke." Dyke said at once, It's not hard to do, Pete. We've got 400,000 each." Pete whistled. "More bread than any of us have ever seen before, ain't it, guys? Ought to give everybody enough to do anything he damn pleases." Dyke thought, "That's right. So right. But if just one man had it all, he'd be set up for life." God, I love that word, life. And I want to spend mine in the chips, a lot of chips, 2 million of them. This 2 million. Just before they headed into the Redding Ranch by crossing the cattle guards that led to the vast stretches of pasture land, Pete cut the lights and drove slowly, frowning as if working to remember where he was going, with nothing to guide him except a childhood memory. 2 hours later they were deep into nowhere. But evidently Pete knew where he was going. If he didn't, it wouldn't be worth the guff you'd get if you'd asked him. In a few minutes, Pete shut off the engine, climbed out of the car, and motioned to the others to follow him. "Gonna sleep here, guys. Come on in. We'll make sure where we are and get ready to drive back out of here after we divvy up the 2 million. He reached back into the car to take the keys, then changed his mind and replaced them in the ignition. Better be ready to start pronto, any minute. Now, everybody scatter. Scatter out about 5 or 6 yards away from the car. Not that anybody's going to pull nothing, because you know you'd get your eyes gouged out and your tongue chopped off if you tried. But we'll all sleep the same distance from here, kinda in a circle around the car. Won't be no direction nobody can go without hitting somebody and waking up the whole damn bunch." They all obeyed his instructions. Dyke chose his place on the side of the car nearest the driver's seat. He took off his shoes and put them beside him. Socks would crackle less in dead grass than shoes. He knew he wouldn't sleep, not one solitary wink. He'd lie as still as death, waiting until he heard the other 4 snoring or breathing hard as they slept. All the guns were in the trunk, locked up tight. If Dyke could make that front seat slide under the wheel, turn the key, and roar out of the pasture, he wouldn't care how many of the other four he ran over. When you'd killed once or 100 times, it didn't matter how many more you murdered. He knew it wouldn't be easy to go where he was going in the darkness, but he had a good sense of direction, and he kept his bearings as they drove in. He should be able to avoid fences and ravines, and even wandering mavericks, though he didn't forget for a second that he'd be taking a chance. With every beating, blasting breath, he was surer that he was going to try it. So sure that he knew he wouldn't back out. Not if he fell into a canyon and cracked his head open and died. The chance of getting 2 million bucks, all for himself, was worth any risk. If he could escape the four of them until daylight, he'd have all the group's guns against their switchblade knives. He could mow them down one at a time if they caught up with him. Drive out of the ranch and just keep going. Hide out somewhere and fill suitcases with the money before he took off for, well, maybe Mexico. You could hide down there in the mountains, places where nobody went, where no cops would chase anybody. After a few years, a man could come out of hiding with his hair dyed and maybe a moustache. Live like old Maximilian himself did, before the Mexicans turned on him. Pete was a loud snorer, Dyke remembered. The other three barely missed the snoring level, and shouldn't take them long to drop off. But he found out they were too excited to sleep right away. Zeb asked, "Where do you think you'll all go, man? We got to get out of this country fast. That old goat shield could be found at any time. Where do you think we'd better head for?" Pete said crisply, "I know where I'm going. South America. A town called Ibac. It's in Colombia. Got a cuz that lives there." Kane snorted. "You got goddamn cousins all over the world." Pete laughed raucously. "Yeah, boy, and I use them when I need to. Everybody ought to use their cousins. Pay 'em a few dollars, and they'll take you in at any time. I aim to stay with this Ibac cuz a couple of months, then build me a hell of a big house down there and stay there as long as I live." At last drowsiness overcame the four, and they slept. Dyke waited until he was sure. He pulled himself to a sitting position on his elbows without a sound. He rose an inch at a time. Step by step he started toward the car, taking every hitch noiselessly, his eyes glued to the hulk of the auto in the darkness. He made it. God, he made it. His hand was on the handle of the car door, turning it with only the merest squeak. In the next breath he was into the car. His hand shook as he turned the key in the ignition. Any second it would whir, take off, and free him and his money. Any second. Any second. But the car seldom started on the first try. He remembered that too late. The roar of the motor finally blasted on the third try, but that was too late. A lot too late for Dyke. All four doors of the car burst open at once, and four pairs of hands dragged Dyke off the seat. His eyes were adjusting more to the darkness all the time, and he could see each furious face, hating him. Hating. Pete said, "Can't let this damn devil Whitey wait till morning. Got to kill him right now, and then scram someplace out of here before the vaquero finds him." He landed a kick in Dyke's back, sprawling him onto the ground. At once a spate of kicks followed Pete's, all up and down the victim's body, Dyke felt his ribs crack, his teeth snap off. He sensed the warmth of blood flowing from a dozen breaks in his skin. Ryan said, "I'd rather shoot him than kick him to death. Want me to get a gun, Pete?" But Pete spat hoarsely. "Hell no. Shooting's too damn good for a scum that turns on his buddies. We're going to slice him up a couple of inches at a time. But first, we're going to have our fun with him. Get out your switchblades and have a big go at him, you guys." They whipped out their knives that gleamed in the night, tore off Dyke's clothes and began to stab his already broken body. They dug their blades deep into his face, his arms, his back, his hips. They squeezed the slashes, the faster to ooze blood from him. Zeb yelled, "Hey, look here, man, he ain't got no shoes on. I'll pull his socks off too, so we can get at his toes. Remember how he loved cutting the old man's fingers off? Well, I'll love chopping his toes off, man." Dyke scarcely moved as he felt the excruciating pain of Zeb's blade, lopping off the end of every toe on his left foot. He tensed his body to endure the mutilation of his right foot too, but Zeb's mind seemed to wander, moving his hand up Dyke's thigh, digging his knife deep to carve long lines into the flesh. Dyke made no sound, vowing to himself that he'd never give them the pleasure of begging or screaming. Let them cut him to pieces the way Pete had vowed they'd do. And he'd never yell. Never. Never. And perhaps he wouldn't have, if they'd been decent enough cutters and slicers and mutilators, if they'd slashed him up the way they did Old Shield. One part of the old coot's body was left intact and uncut. The private part. The five didn't touch him there. Dyke had never been part of a group of killers who'd cut off sex organs. They'd always done things clean, even killing. But he went even tighter as Pete said, "Say, you dopes want to know what I never done but always wanted to? Been saving it for the meanest devil anywhere, and I got him right here. Nobody ain't meaner than the damn devil himself that steal from his own gang." He yanked on Dyke's hair, lifted his head for a minute. "All right, you damn devil. You never heard about honour among thieves, or however they say it? Well, I'm going to show you that you ought to learn it." Dyke tried to raise himself and then fell back in his bleeding weakness, knowing that he would not have the strength to raise if he'd been alone. And the four figures who were still stabbing him would not have let him crawl a foot from their flashing blades. He closed his eyes and tried to steel his nerves and muscles. God, they couldn't do that to him. Not castration. A man was better off dead than castrated. Forgetting his vow to be silent, unable to hold back his plea if he tried, he screamed, No, don't cut me there. Slice off anything else, but leave me that." Pete shouted fiendishly, then ran a knee under Dyke's back to lift his groin close. The man's blade shot downward once, then once again. Dyke felt the flashes of pain almost too great to bear, pain that was not only physical, but mental too. Mind-boggling. Ryan said, "He ought to be dead by now. Or he will be awfully soon. Might as well just quit cutting him." But Pete said, "We want to make sure, Red Man. We're going to slice him up and be damn sure he's deader than anything." Kane said, "I know something real hellish we can do to him, man, and I'm going to do it." He pulled a noosed lariat from his pocket. You guys all got your strangling ropes? If you have, give 'em to me. Zeb said, We don't want to kill him yet, do we? I ain't going to kill his body. I'm just going to mash in his brain. They handed their ropes over to Kane and braided them, wound them round and round Dyke's head and began to tighten the nooses. Tighter and tighter he pulled them. Dyke felt his head being crushed inside the ropes, the skin breaking, running blood. His brains would be popping out next, he was sure. He'd die and spill his brains all over this lousy pasture, and tomorrow birds had gobbled them up. Pete suddenly whispered, Hey, shut up, all of you. I hear something somewheres. They stilled in a second. Something was moving not far from them. It could be a stray cow or calf or steer, but it could be a vaquero. And a cowboy could mean a cop. Dyke knew that his 4 torturers knew it. Ryan urged, Let's leave, what do you say? Someone could have found the old man and be out looking for us. Pete spit, landing the spittle in Dyke's eyes. You know, nobody gonna find that old cat for days, maybe weeks. All right, you dopes. But wait a minute. I'm gonna see if this devil's dead. Dyke held his breath, didn't let the slightest gasp or movement escape him as Pete bent close and inspected him. Dyke had played dead more than once in fun. He could do it now for real. Pete stood up. He's a goner, all right. Everybody get in the car. They piled in with Pete at the wheel and took off. Dyke couldn't raise his head to watch them leave, but he heard the motor zoom, roar, settle down, and die away in the distance. He heard something threshing through the weeds and cacti, making no attempt to go unheard. He opened his eyes for a brief breath of lucidity, and he met the gaze of a startled maverick calf that was standing over him. In the next second the animal was gone, crashing through the bush and into the darkness. Dyke thought, God, I'm dying. I asked for it, and I got it. But any one of them would have done the same if he'd got the chance. Every damned one of us hated the guts of every other one. We only stuck together to protect ourselves, and to have something to eat if any guy had any money to buy anything. Now they'll all get away. Damn them. They'll get to Mexico or South America instead of me. Right here in this pasture on the Redding Ranch I'll die, and nobody will ever find me. There are scavengers here, coyotes and hawks and sometimes vultures. They'll eat the flesh off my dead bones, and nobody but nobody will ever know what happened to me.